to Sunday morning here in my garden. Beautiful summer's day, winter's day. And it's Comrades today. And good luck to everyone that's running, to all my friends, a couple of them that's climbing that mountain again, going uphill this year. Wish them all the best. I think the winner is about to come in a couple of minutes. But anyway, we're thinking about them today. But it is an incredible winter's day out here. It was really, really cold this morning. Slept in a bit, have to confess. But yeah, still beautiful out here in Durban. KZN's winters are some of the best in the world. Right, back to our subject here. Last week, we finished off a little series called Are There Two Creation Accounts in Genesis? And so we ended that, concluding that, yeah, it does seem like the two creation accounts are a form of doublets, which we find in the Old Testament. Two different stories, aiming at two different results, and actually portraying a very different idea of how things started and how things work. But anyway, that's not our topic for today, but we are going to stay in the book of Genesis. And so you might be asking, well, why Genesis again? Well, the reality is that Genesis is a large book. It's got about 50 chapters going. And there's so many small stories in there. And over the years, we've used all of our moral lessons to encourage one another. Moral ideas that we get from these books. Some good, and others quite troubling. And it's really in the last 10 years, it's the troubling ones that have been troubling me. Some of these accounts, it's very hard to reconcile them with a modern way of looking at morality or love. And so should it be, because it is a very, very ancient book. So we're going to be exploring in the next, I think it'll take us about 4 sessions to work through the book of Genesis. We're going to be running through the entire thing, but obviously just skimming over most of the major themes and most of the important stories. But we're going to be having a look at Genesis from ancient or through ancient eyes. In other words, the whole goal of walking through it in this way is to try and see Genesis from the perspective, try being the operative, that people that wrote this book and the people that it was written to, in other words, the ancient audience of Genesis, how they would have understood the stories that are found in the book of Genesis. And that's going to be our mission right throughout. And I truly believe that if you stick with me through these couple of sessions, you will never be able to look at Genesis in the same way again. Tori asked me the other day, Frans, why are you still doing this? Why are you doing this? Why are you hammering on all these things? And the reality is just simply for me that, small detour here, being a pastor for so many years, 20 years, 2 decades, and preaching a lot, traveling a lot preaching, and sometimes for a long period of my life, twice on a Sunday, I used to view Genesis in a certain way and used to speak from it a certain way. And unfortunately, the way that many churches are structured is that what comes from the pulpit is basically God speaking us the word of God. So, but the reality is that what comes from our pulpits, and even what's coming to you today, is an interpretation of the scriptures that we have. And it needs to be checked and it needs to be verified. And the reason why I'm still here doing all of this is because I feel a certain of burden to correct some of the things that I've said in the past. As I've come to a new understanding of how, let's talk about Genesis should be read, I've realized that over the years, many people might have taken my ideas of Genesis the wrong way, and I might have, in ignorance, been teaching it in the wrong way. So I feel a kind of a responsibility, really, to keep at it and putting a better perspective forward, a more balanced, a more historical, a more real perspective of the book of Genesis. And that's why I'm still here pushing these type of ideas and bringing some of the scholarly work, in other words, the work that professionals have done on the book of Genesis, that can be found in books all over. But the reality is people don't have time to read scholarly books. To break some of that stuff down and kind of feed it into these sessions, so that it's accessible to anybody who's got a couple of minutes to watch on YouTube. So that's kind of like the story, why I'm still motivated to do what I'm doing. I'm still passionate about it, and I'm still reading my butt off learning about what the historians and the people that spend their lives studying these things, not in churches but in universities, what they have found, and that's incredibly important and interesting to me, at least. So we're going to start today with an introduction to the book of Genesis, and at some point we'll be very, very briefly walking across the two or the creation accounts again, but from a completely different perspective. So there won't be a lot of repetition in all of this. But today we're going to be starting off with an introduction to the book of Genesis. In other words, just a brief overview. Now, if you've been reading this book forever, you can't skip this section because there are some important things that we need to unlearn and some new perspectives that we need to be looking from. So reading the book of Genesis for a large portion of the church's history is just basically reading it for exactly what it says and just taking everything literally and not looking at anything beyond the book of Genesis to try and interpret what's going on inside the book of Genesis. But because we've now unearthed and deciphered so much ancient writing from this time and from before this time, we can now look at Genesis in a proper context. And that's the key for really understanding what's going on in there. Of course, there's still a lot that needs to be said and learned and needs to be deciphered. But the reality is that scholars' work over the last 2 centuries has brought us to a place where we can quite confidently say we understand Genesis better now because we can see it inside of its context. Context is incredibly important when me and you talk, or when you have a conversation with someone, maybe an inside joke with your friend. The context is everything. Without the context, the words can obviously often be construed to mean actually anything. And that's often what happens with the Bible. If we throw away the historical context, we kind of turn the book of Genesis into whatever we want it to mean. Some believe it needs to be taken literally, and some believe it only needs to be taken figuratively. And both of those views in the extreme is wrong. And so the most important factor, and I think this little study will show that scholars have found, is that the most important factor for reading a book like Genesis is to understand the context of Genesis. In other words, in what time was it written? What did that time look like? What were people around that time writing about? Who was it written by? And almost most importantly, who was it actually written for? Now, you might have heard this saying, I've said it a couple of times over the last couple of years, that the Bible wasn't written to us, but it was written for us. In other words, we have to understand that historically, the book of Genesis was written to the Israelites. It was their book, written by them and for them. The fact that we later included it in our biblical canon, which I'll refer to as the Hebrew Bible from here on, the Old Testament for Christians, that's a later development. The idea that it is inspired is something that came a little bit later. People later on, Israelites later on, decided that the book of Genesis was an inspired writing, and in fact that God inspired it, and that's why they included it in their canon. Canon just means their set of books, right? Their library. That's what the word Bible also means. It means library. They included it because they believed it was inspired, but the people who wrote it initially would have had no idea that they were writing books that would be part of a Bible. Sorry. Having to switch to data. I'm not sure what's going on with the Wi-Fi these days. Back to the point. These writers, or writer, we'll have a look at that, they were writing to ancient people, and they had a specific purpose why they were writing to these people. And so part of the series is going to be trying to figure out from the internal evidence from the book of Genesis, more or less when it could have been written, why the stories look the way they do. Many stories, very interesting stories. If you're not very familiar with the book of Genesis, the book of Genesis it's got a lot of variety in it and some really important stories in there. And learning to see it in the context of who it was written for, I think is incredibly important before we go away and use them as literal beating sticks with which we beat each other denominations and non-Christians. So that's in a nutshell our journey that we're going to be embarking on today. We're going to be slowly working through the 50 chapters of this. Well, I can't actually say slowly. It'll have to be fast for us to do it in the 4 sessions. But we're going to be working through the 50 chapters. We're going to try and follow the story, try and understand why the story looks the way that it actually does. Okay, so why do this study? Well, I think that Genesis, I have to say this before I start. This study that we're putting together here is more or less based on a book. This book is called Genesis for Normal People, and it's by Professor Pete Enns and Jared Byas, and it's by an organization called The Bible for Normal People. So if you would like to get hold of this book, give me let me know in the comments or send me a DM, and I will get the link for the book out to you. I would recommend this book to everyone. This is the second time I'm reading through this book. The first time was about 3 or 4 years ago. And so it's going to be loosely based on this book. And this book itself is a book to make scholarly ideas known to the average Joe like me and you without too much scholarly jargon. And in other words, it's for the layperson. You just pick it up and read. It's an easy read. It's a funny read. There's a lot of comedy in it. It's really good if you're going to be spending 400 Rand on a book this week and you are interested in the Bible. This is the type of reading that you should be doing. My opinion, of course, is that Christians should be learning more about their Bible and not just taking on what they've always believed and what people around them tell them to believe about it. Okay, so I needed to say that. The question then is why? Why is Genesis so important to look at? Well, the thing is that Genesis is possibly the most misunderstood book in the Hebrew Bible, and we can, for that, probably include the Christian Bible, barring possibly Revelation, the book of Revelation, which is also a very misunderstood book, but not only misunderstood, but also abused. And yes, unfortunately, it is true that as Christians, we often abuse our scriptures because we flog them into the shape we need for our specific situations. In other words, we force them to be for our context, and that's where the nonsense starts. The moment we take scripture, that which is written by ancients for ancients, and we pretend and sometimes fully believe that this little portion here was written for me and my situation. It's a very dangerous way to read the Bible. It's caused a lot of heartache and pain in the past, and I think it's the wrong way to approach the scriptures. And so in this way, the book of Genesis is one of those books that's been abused by mostly Christians that just haven't taken the time to do the type of study that me and you are going to be doing in these 4 sessions. Christians that only live off ideas that come from pulpits when it comes to the idea of Genesis, they are going to be left with a dogmatic view of Genesis, and they're never really going to have a grasp on the historical context of Genesis, and because there's just no time for that type of thing from pulpits, and it's pretty sad. And I say that not because I'm pointing fingers, because ultimately I'm pointing that finger at myself. I did that for 20 years, trying to correct that now. So there's a lot of weight, a lot of burden on the book of Genesis because of the type of stories that we find in Genesis. Genesis, for instance, in the creation accounts, we go to Genesis to explain what God is like. We go to Genesis to explain, well, these are modern questions, but people go there to find out where the universe comes from. We go to Genesis to find out the order between humans, animals, angels, and also the rank between, for instance, men and women. Like Genesis, we expect Genesis to be able to explain all these things to us. Genesis also is supposed to be teaching us of what life is like, the beginning of life, where sin comes from, what death is like, where languages comes from, what universal floods were there, how do we understand gods, angels, sons of God. Some of these terms we still don't really have a grasp on. It's difficult for modern people to think of something like sons of God, like some type of heavenly beings. Some use Genesis to prove the beginning of the idea of demons or giants, and why we have rainbows, and etc., etc. A lot of people that are ethnically inclined, let's use that word, use Genesis to prove why certain races are cursed from the beginning and still are. It's terrible. It's maybe a very good example of one of the abuses of a book like Genesis. Genesis also, as we'll say in a moment or so, is a book that tells us about the beginning of Israel. And that's kind of a central thing that we'll be having a look quickly. So we said earlier that there are 50 chapters in Genesis. It starts with the beginning or the ordering of the cosmos, and it ends with a nation, Israel, in Egyptian slavery. The book literally ends with Joseph dying and his body being, after 110 years being alive, his body being put in an Egyptian coffin. So the book takes us from the ordering of the cosmos in the first couple of chapters. By the end of this book, chapter 50, around there, we have a nation that have moved into Egypt, first on very good terms, and later on they multiplied too much. They became slaves, and they were employed in slave activity, and now they are stuck. They're stuck as a people, as the slaves of this mighty, mighty world empire, the Egyptians. So that's the span of the book of Genesis, and there's a long story in between. Right. But as the book suggests, the word Genesis is a Greek word, and it literally means origin. And so maybe you're inclined to think, oh, origin, yes, how the world began. And I want to make a counter argument to that. I want to say that I don't think that's what is meant by the word Genesis. The main theme in Genesis is not the beginning of the universe or the initial ordering of the cosmos and the order of life as we have here. If we really want to be consistent to what's really in the book of Genesis, it kind of more refers to the beginning of Israel. And this is a very, very important point that we have to make, and we're going to be making from time to time, and I'm going to repeat it quite often. But this book is the book of the origins of Israel. And I'll be putting forth some reasoning why it is thought that's really what's going on here. This is not a book that was written to tell 21st century South Africans or Americans or Swiss how the world began. That was not the purpose of this book. Much closer to the purpose was to tell Israelites where they come from, where their origin and their beginning is. And that's why we have all these lineages that we always skip over as we're reading, because it's trying to trace an Israel now found at the end of the book in slavery in Egypt, trying to trace them all the way back, and their beginnings all the way back to what seems to be the first humans, Adam and Eve, mentioned very early in the book. So I think this is something that we're going to be hammering on a lot to get our perspective right on this book. It wasn't written for us. In other words, we have modern questions that we put before Genesis that Genesis simply, number one, is silent on. Number two, excuse me. Excuse me. Apologies. Genesis is silent on many of our modern questions. And so we need to really ask, what questions is Genesis really trying to answer? And for those answers, we have to go to why it was written and who it was written for. It was written to Israelites. It was trying to answer the questions of the Israelites, right? We need to note that the book of Genesis is really just the first book of the Torah. So the Torah, or the Pentateuch in Greek, is the first 5 books of the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. It's the most important 5 books. It's also referred to in other ways like the law of Moses or the law. These first 5 books, which Jews will call the Torah, and I'm going to be calling it the Torah from here on. These are the really central books in Jewish religion, and of course also for Christians. This is an incredibly important core of where the Christian religion comes from. So we have the books Genesis, Exodus. I was going to let Tori recite it because she learned it at VCA. We didn't learn it like that. So anyway, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. These 5 books, they form what what's called the Torah. But very, very important to understand is that these 5 books, number one, they don't stand independent of one another. They all tell their own portion of an overarching story. And so Genesis, it's important to understand, and we're going to spend more time on that today, that Genesis is a book within a series. Or I think the best way to explain this is to think of the way that today we don't really watch too many movies anymore. We watch series, right? And sometimes these series can go into seasons. And I would like to explain the Torah as a series with many seasons in it. And one of these seasons, or the first season, is really the book of Genesis. The point of that being that it's not a standalone book. It wasn't written to stand alone. It wasn't edited and put together to stand alone. It was the first part, the first season of this entire unfolding series of the Israelite story. And so this is going to be very important for us to keep this in mind. Often we as Christians, especially moderns, we grab little stories out of Genesis, or we'll grab Genesis as a whole and think of it as a standing alone episode that is there to give us moral support or moral guidance, but it isn't what it was written for initially. It's part of the whole thing. It's part of the first 5 books. It's the first installment of these other books. And in a moment, we're going to be talking about when it was written, by who it was written, and then I'll say a little bit more of why this is important. So it's not just it's number one, it's part of the Torah, and it's only the beginning of the story of Israel. It's the origin, it's the beginning of this story. And the kind of Genesis only sets the stage for the real drama to come, when Israel comes out of Egypt and they're on their way to the promised land. So keep that in mind. I think that is rather important. Not just a collection of short stories, but it's the story of the origin of Israel, the people of God. One thing we cannot lose sight of is this book of the beginning was written specifically for the people of whom it speaks, so that they could understand their origin. Oftentimes we lose sight of that. We think that this book was written, Genesis was written so that we can understand where the Israelites come from and where the world comes from. That is not essentially correct. What is more true is that it was actually written to the Israelites so that they could understand where they came from, what their God was like, and what their purpose was in this world. That's why they are the main character in this series. Okay, so Genesis is an ancient story about the genesis of Israel. That's really what's going on here. And if you can keep your eye on that, that's going to set you up for a way better understanding of some of these more difficult stories that we're going to be encountering. The burning and controversial question always then begs, is this collection of stories, are they actual, accurate historical accounts? So this is the wall you're going to run into every time you look at Genesis try and look at it from an objective perspective, is you're going to be faced with the question, did this really happen like this? Are these accurate historical accounts? Or what's the alternative? Well, the alternative is that Genesis could be something like what other nations have, and they're called origin myths. And that means stories that were told about the beginnings of a nation or a people that were not understood to be literal, accurate historical accounts. It's just not how people of that time wrote. But these stories carried almost higher truths about the identity and the purpose of a people. And so they weren't written to recall actual history, but they were actually written, these origin myths were written to convey if I can use the word, theological understanding of a people, where they come from, what their purpose is, and what their God is like. That was the story is just a vehicle to convey the real truth. And often these stories then were shaped or formed. They might have had a kernel of historical, like an anchor, but they were mostly shaped for the time in which they were written. So the question is then, is Genesis accurate historical data, um, as we would expect as modern Christians. We fundamentalists. I grew up as a fundamentalist, so that's how I've read Genesis all my life. Um, or is it more towards the side of stories that convey theological ideas, identity, and purpose, and in that way they not necessarily need to be historical accounts. They lean towards the side of origin myths, which is a phenomena that we do find with many other nations, writing about their own beginnings for their own people. So that's the question. Hopefully we'd be able to answer some of that in these 5 sessions. It's not always that easy though. Okay. Let me just get back to my notes here. Right. So one thing we have to understand is that this book is not a history textbook, right? It wasn't written to convey exact historical accounts necessarily. That's not what's really going on here. And it also wasn't written as a science textbook. It's not what it is. It's not the genre of what's going on here. But it can be better understood as a book that contains the principles and the life lessons and the teaching that the Israelites needed so that they could understand how to think about God and how to think about themselves and their lives, their identity, and their place in this world. Sure, some of these lessons we can apply to our modern lives, like we do, and we have, and I most certainly have used parts of Genesis to teach myself a lesson, or to teach a lesson to my children, or to teach an idea or an encouragement or a warning to people around me. We could use it like that, but it is not the reason why it was written. And as long as you keep that distinction in mind, it's okay to use it now and again, as long as you don't get confused with the reason why the book was written. And the reason why I'm saying that is that if you think this was written for 21st century people, you're going to get stuck with some real moral problems in the book of Genesis. You have to keep sight of who wrote it and who it was written for. Okay. It is much more probable that the scribes who penned down these lessons wrote them down for the people of their kind and their own time. Right? That's the basic premise we need to get our heads around. And by the end of these 4 sessions, I believe that you will, some of you for the first time, have gotten your head around the idea that Genesis was actually written for ancient people. And there's a lot of things in the book of Genesis that points to that quite clearly once we know a little bit about the context. I'm hoping to convey some of those ideas in this time. A world, and this was a world that we're not so familiar with, right? It was a primitive place. It was a really challenging time in history. And it looked a lot different to ours. Although we can and we should learn from that world, our modern filters often get in the way of understanding the stories the way that those people would have understood them. In other words, our modern context, our modern filters that we have, and we all have those filters, often gets in the way from reading Genesis the way that an ancient would have read it. Now, we're not going to pretend like we are ancients and that we can perfectly decipher everything, but there is value in at least trying to understand the context and at least learning to put your modern filters, your modern context to the side when you're engaging in ancient text like this. And there's value, real value in that. And I'm hoping that this will be a valuable exercise to you. Right, so Genesis is the first part of a series called the Torah. To make true sense of Genesis, we have to put it then in its rightful place. And for that, we need to look at the story of the Torah as a whole so that we could place Genesis. Is it? The entire Torah will give us, looking at the entire Torah, will give us the rightful place of Genesis inside of it. Number one, the Torah is really old, right? We're going to be talking about some dates, but it's a different world back then. It's much older than the New Testament or Christianity itself. Torah means law or instruction, and it is called such by Jews because the climax of the series, all right, the climax of the whole 5 books, all the seasons together, really is the place where the people of God, Israel, where they camp out at Mount Sinai and they receive the law and the covenant, the place where they become the people of God and they get the instructions to live in that way then as the people of God. That's the climax of the entire series. And it sits more or less in the middle of these 5 seasons. And the point of that is to understand that people weren't writing the books of Genesis, the book of Genesis, the way we have it today, as they were going. Yeah. It was written quite a bit later, and we'll look at that in a moment. But the point is that when we then read Genesis and the things that happened before Mount Sinai, we can see in that they are reflecting Sinai back into those previous portions, and also the pieces that come after Sinai. They reflect Mount Sinai into the future as well. This we can see just from knowing, by reading, of course, but we can anticipate this because this is the center of this whole mini series and all the seasons. Is God is their God. He chose them, and He has made a covenant with them, and He's given them these instructions. I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler, for instance, to illustrate the point. Abraham is spoken of someone who had obeyed the law. Wow, okay. There was no law when Abraham was around. That doesn't make any sense. It's anachronistic. What's going on? Is the Bible incorrect? Are they messing around? They're trying to deceive us. No. They're writing these older portions in terms of the law. Everything is about the law. And so we'll have a look, but it's just an example of how it is used, or how the law or the central event is reflected back into the older portions and reflected forward into the future portions. Okay. To make the point of the centrality of Mount Sinai, a little more than half of the Torah, believe it or not, is where the Israelites are camped out around Mount Sinai. So just from a time perspective, or a percentage of words used, for instance, Mount Sinai is the main deal. That's what the Torah is about. It's the center of the series, right? So everything in the Torah before this or after this magnificent event reflects to it or from it. It's absolutely the center. It is there that the Israelites will find out who they are as God's people, number one, very important. And number two, how to live as God's people. And this is the information, this is the most important information that comes from the Torah. And this is the information that is then in the future generations, until today, is still being discussed and still being interpreted, is this center portion. And of course, this would lead to them inheriting the land which was promised to them, which I obviously get quite a bit later. Here they are told to forsake all other gods, and they got to follow Yahweh. Yahweh is the name of their God alone. In what was then at that time quite a polytheistic general culture, only Yahweh is worthy of worship because He is the real creator of the world, and He is the savior of Israel. So what is the role of the book of Genesis inside this large series, all these seasons that center in the Torah? Well, Genesis sets the stage. Genesis is the opening act. It focuses on the fact that God is their God is the only creator, and it hints at a time where He would not only be creator, but He would also be savior. So the main saving event of Yahweh for the Israeli people, of course, is from the Egyptian bondage. So not only is He creator, but He will also be savior. But of course, in Genesis, we don't have the Exodus yet, and that's the next season. But there are things in the book of Genesis that's constantly hinting forward to this deliverance or the saving that would happen. So the rest of the Torah, then after the book of Genesis, it focuses on the saving of Israel. And it reminds us of God, the creator of the world. So Genesis introduces God as creator while giving us some previews of God, their savior. Creating and saving become like the two sides of a coin for the God of Israel. And in a moment, we're going to be talking about the national disaster, the exile. But once again, they would be in need of their God saving them. And this is a very important context for us when we consider the book of Genesis. Okay, let's move on to our next topic here, and that is, when was Genesis written? Right. So if you grew up like me, I grew up in a Pentecostal fundamentalist denomination. It is Protestant, of course. Um, and in that denomination, as in many others, and I'm just mentioning where I come from, but in many others, people believe that Moses wrote not only Genesis, but the entire Torah. In other words, Moses is responsible, single person Moses, wrote the entire miniseries with all its seasons, and that would include the Genesis that we speak of. We say this because it became known as the Law of Moses, and it was understood to have been written by Moses. You go to the New Testament, it is just like a given. It's part of the New Testament that the writers of the New Testament and the Gospels, and I believe Paul possibly as well, all just assume that Moses wrote the law, because that's the tradition that was handed over to them. And of course, that tradition still lives today. If you go to most churches today, they would still tell you that Moses wrote Genesis. Scholars, however, in the last 200 years, they've done a lot of work in looking at internal evidence. In other words, not just the tradition that was being carried over, but actually the internal evidence from books of the Torah to see if that suggests that Moses actually did write all of it. And then we'll narrow that down to Genesis as we get there. Why is this an important question? Who wrote Genesis? Well, when we have an understanding of when Genesis was written, it helps us to understand what we are reading in the stories inside of Genesis. I don't want to take too much time to explain this to you because it's not so obvious to everyone. It wasn't that obvious to me until I started spending time in this. But if you know, maybe I need to spend a little bit of time. If someone writes an autobiography of Nelson Mandela, you're going to get some perspectives in there that some people will not agree on. And so in order to understand and to read the stories more objectively, you need to understand that it is the function of someone's subjective writing. And you need to pin down, you need to point at when was it written and by who was it written and what does the context look like. The point is that if someone wrote a biography of Nelson Mandela, if a white racist person wrote a biography of Nelson Mandela 10 years ago, and a leader of the ANC writes a biography of Nelson Mandela 20 years from now, it's going to look completely different. And knowing who wrote it and when it was written will help you understand why they are motivating the things they do, why they're saying the things they do. It's just, that's how things work. Now, Genesis and the Torah is not accepted, is not an exception to any of this. Knowing who wrote it and when it was written will help us read it better, right? So if you think that Genesis 1 is written to 21st century people who understand relative gravity, who understands the evolution of the cosmos and Big Bang Theory, you're going to read it completely different to if you realize that the people who wrote Genesis 1, their cosmology was absolutely primitive. They had no real sense of science even back there, and they had an ancient Mesopotamian way of looking at the world. Knowing who wrote it and who it was written for is incredibly important to actually understand what has been written down. Okay, so knowing something about the historical context in which a book was written helps us to better understand the message of the writer. So this is why this is an important question. Just because Genesis was included in our Bibles, it doesn't mean that we can read it the way we want to read it, because it does not mean that it was written for 21st century readers or with them in mind. It is ancient, written for ancients, later recognized as inspired and included in the Hebrew canon and then also the Christian biblical canon. So how old is the book of Genesis, right? Here we run into the same problem that scholars run into with all ancient writings. Number one, with most ancient literature, number one, it is anonymous. And when you say it's anonymous, it just simply means the writer of Genesis or the Torah does not tell us, hi, me, Moses, wrote this book at this point at that time. There's nothing like that in the Torah or in Genesis. In other words, therefore, it's classified as anonymous. We don't know who wrote it because they didn't tell us. Okay, so the fact that people later say Moses wrote this, Kursi wrote that, yeah, it's great, but there's no evidence. There's no evidence in the book itself that says this person wrote this book, right? So the book is anonymous. It doesn't actually tell us who the author was. Jewish and Christian tradition, of course, labeled Moses as the author of the book. Um, which includes Genesis. I mean, the Torah, which includes Genesis. He is, after all, the main character. Now, that we don't doubt. Moses is the main dude in the book of, in the Torah as a whole. And maybe that was their only option, not knowing who wrote it. They felt like, Moses is the best option for this. But there are very good reasons why the label of Moses writing Torah and Genesis is no longer accepted by most scholars. There's three quick ones here, but you could literally read several books on this issue, and it's out there. And I encourage, if it's something you find interesting, get out there and read it. Three reasons I'm quickly going to mention that the book I read mentions is that the Torah records Moses' death and burial in Deuteronomy 34. A little bit creepy when someone writes about their own death and burial. Number two, the writer tells us that to this day, no one knows where Moses was buried. Once again, a little bit strange. Moses writing in the third person about himself, about how nobody knows where he was buried. This is obviously a different person writing at a much later time, because it says to this day. You don't use that phrase until if it's a lot later. Nobody knows where he was buried. This is from Deuteronomy 34:7. And then also, the writer of Deuteronomy says that since Moses' day, no one has ever risen like him. So once again, we have Moses in the third person, somebody else writing about him. It seems like it was written quite a bit later by the type of language that's used. And this is just using internal evidence to try and tell us who wrote these books. It does sound from these quick three things, at least, that the book was written by someone else that lived in a rather long time after the time of Moses. Actually, the whole Torah reads like this. It reads like a story about the distant past. Just read it for yourself with an open mind, and you'll see that that's how it reads. Moses, yes, of course, is a character that is spoken of in the third person. The Torah is a story about Adam, Noah, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, and the Israelites who left Egypt, traveled to Mount Sinai. It's a bit strange to think of Moses writing about himself all this time in the third person, writing about his death, or writing that in Numbers 12:3 that he was the most humble person on earth. It just doesn't seem like that's something a humble person would be writing. There are other reasons for thinking Moses did not write the Torah and therefore Genesis, but it's beyond our scope that we're engaging here. So the question is, who wrote Genesis and when did he live? Bible scholars have been working on this question for the last 2 centuries. Their work has led to the following conclusion. So I'm just going to drop in here with a statement without putting any proof on the table. But the conclusion of most Bible scholars, except like the hardcore fundamentalist group, is that the Torah as we know it today did not come together until sometime after 539 BCE. Right, okay, so that's about 540 years before Christ. That's about 2,570 or 60 years ago. That's a long, long time ago. But it is much later than what we would expect. We all hope that Moses had a little notebook there and wrote everything down, and so all of Genesis can be traced straight back to Moses, and it was written, as the creation was, he's just writing everything down as it happens. But it just doesn't seem like that is what's going on here. Why 539 BC? But of course, 539 BC is the return from exile of the Israelites. If you don't know, those of you who do, just bear with me for half a second. The Israelites went into exile. The Babylonians came and destroyed everything in 586 BC, destroyed their temple and took the elites out of the nation. And then again in 539 BC, about 50 years later, the Persians clobbered the Babylonians and allowed the Jews to come back. And so most scholars believe that the book didn't come into its full, the Torah didn't come to its full form we have today before this return from exile, so 539 BC. Now, how did they come to this conclusion? Well, for Genesis, which is our focus here, there are clues that point us in this direction, some of which have been noted by Jewish and Christian scholars for hundreds of years. Let me give you one or two quick examples. In the story of Abraham in Genesis 12, this is a long time ago. Abraham's supposed to have lived 2000 BC. That's a long time ago, right? But in Genesis 12:6 and 13:7, we read that the Canaanites were living in the land then or at that time. So it makes sense that the writer is writing in the time that the Canaanites do not live in the land. So the writer is obviously writing from a future time, right? According to the biblical account, it was not until the time of the kings David and Solomon that the Canaanites were finally driven out. In other words, this gives us an idea. This is and this happens in around 1000 BCE. This gives us an idea that the writer is writing from a time that was definitely no earlier than 1000 BCE, right? So it gives us an early barrier. So here we have a clue that some parts of Genesis come from sometime after 1000 BCE. Although it is telling a story that is set in the time of Abraham, which is probably 2000, 2000 BCE. Okay, in another example, in Genesis 36, we read of the list of the kings of Edom. The writer introduces the list in this way. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Boom. This should, red lights and bells should be going off. How can someone in Genesis 36 know that there would come a time when Israel would have kings? They couldn't. So this is obviously an account written in retrospect from a time where there were kings already that were reigning and ruling over the Israelites. Once again, putting us at more or less 1000 BC, King David or Solomon, and once again indicates for us that someone is writing from a much later time about a story, which is Genesis 36 is about Esau, because Esau is the father of the Edomites, and is writing about a time that was much earlier. So these type of things are all over Genesis, and they give us an idea that Genesis was written a lot later by people that are reflecting on the past. In other words, nobody was writing the stuff as they were going along. Thus, for this reasons, and other scholars believe Israel's stories began to be written down around the time of King David. So this is where we think they started writing down the stories. That seems to be the evidence from the accounts themselves. And this was also in the time that the Israelites, really for the first time, became settled in the land. They had time to think, to search, do some soul searching, and maybe to start keeping records. And this is the time in which we also then get 1 and 2 Samuel, 1 and 2 Kings, and also possibly some of the Psalms are written down from this time period. So the last thing we need to get to today, and I'm slightly over time, but I'm going to take some liberty here, is that if they started writing from about 1000 BCE, in other words, after King David and Solomon or during their time, scholars also believe that there was a time in which this writing was accelerated, and this comes in the time of Israel's national disaster. Right. So, although the writing of the records might have started during King David and Solomon, it was accelerated by the exile of Israel from Judah to Babylon. This is 586 BCE. This is the 6th century. But why would this event, this national disaster, why would it make anyone write anymore? Well, God promised them the land of Canaan forever, with a line of kings that would descend from David, ruling in Jerusalem, right? But when the Babylonians came in 586 BCE and destroyed the temple, wrecked Jerusalem, and took a massive bunch of them, including their elites, captive, the Israelites hit an ultimate low. What has happened is God has abandoned us. So what's going on? They have to try and make sense of who they are. Are they still God's people? Has God forsaken them? Has he abandoned them? They're sitting in Babylonian exile, and all these promises that they believed in is in jeopardy, at least. So it stands to reason that it's during this time that those who could write, the scribes, did the writing of the soul searching of the nation trying to put down on paper and make sense of their disaster, reflecting on their past, where they come from, what their God is like, what he promised, how he promised, calling them from the time of Abraham and promising land and prosperity to them. And they started putting their writing into high gear to tell the story, not only to their generation, but also to the generations that would come during this time of national trauma. to encourage people to be faithful to God, because God would eventually be faithful to them again. So this Torah comes together to encourage exiled Israelites, and to help them understand who they are as a people, where they come from, and why this disaster has happened to them. They were unfaithful to the calling of God, and this is why, and in this way, the Torah, besides instructing them now on how to live, really kind of forms the constitution of the nation. This is who we are. This is what we believe. This is where we come from. This is what our God is like. He has been faithful in the past. And if we remain faithful, He will remember His promises and He will restore us. Now, the whole point of all of this is that the accelerated writing down of the stories, the oral stories, and possibly earlier writings came together as a unit in Torah form, probably around the time of the end of this exile, during to the end of the exile, let's say 6th century BCE, just to be safe then. Remember, there were some generations, and maybe two, born in Babylon, completely disconnected from the temple and the history of the Jews. And this was their way to connect those disconnected generations by writing things down and reading it out to them, and making them understand where they come from. The Torah serves the purpose then to inform this disconnected generation also, connecting them to their God and their land. There would have been constant pressure in Babylon to cave into Babylonian way of life, Babylonian religion, Babylonian ways of reading, understanding themselves and God, or the gods for the Babylonians. And this could be the reason. This is so important. This is the most important thing I'm going to say today in these final seconds. This could be the reason why so many stories in Genesis are explicitly anti-Babylonian. Well, if you get this, you get Genesis. The stories are explicitly anti-Babylonian because they come from a time which Babylon was pressuring Israel. They not only destroyed their temple, took them captive, but the Israelites were under pressure to conform to Babylonian ideas. You get this in the book of Daniel, for instance, where this is the story of Daniel, this prophet, whatnot. But the point is that he was under pressure to cave to Babylonian ways, and in the story he doesn't. So to read Genesis through this lens helps us to understand what it is trying to communicate to its audience. It was written to remind exiled Israelites of who their God is in the midst of Babylonian culture after the trauma of the exile in which they lost everything. It is a theological response to Babylonian captivity. Hold on, let me just say that one more time. You get this, you get Genesis. Genesis, the book of Genesis, is a theological response to the Babylonian captivity. Thus, my final words, thus, to understand Genesis better, we have learned more. We have to learn more about the conditions under which it would have been compiled. Genesis is a story of the beginning of a nation of Israel, told through the eyes of Israelites who find themselves amidst or in the wake of the national crisis of the exile in Babylon. If you can put that in your files, you don't have to believe it. Just put it there and remember it for next time. This is the key to understand the book of Genesis. And then the stories make a lot more sense. I've a little bit over my time. Thank you so much for being with me this morning. Next week is Father's Day, and next week we're not going to have a broadcast. So I'll let you know on the Instagram and Facebook pages when our next broadcast will be, probably the week after that. Thanks so much for being with me. Enjoy your Sunday. Cheers.